further discuss this now with Arwa Damon. She's the founder and president of INARA, the International Network for Aid, Relief and Assistance, and she joins me live now in the studio. First off, thank you for joining us. Netanyahu said that he's going to be allowing a basic amount of aid into the Strip to avoid famine. What does that mean?
It's perhaps best compared to trying to use a Q-tip to try to stop a massive arterial bleed at best. You know, when we look at sort of the impact that hunger and starvation has had in Gaza, and then you look at the amount of, trucks that they're talking about, it's barely going to be enough to sort of stem the flow of the illnesses, the disease, the psychological stress, the impact of malnutrition, especially that is having on, the youngest of bodies. If you look at the situation on the ground right now, and, I get messages from our team there all the time, they describe it as being absolutely insane. Children are wandering around the streets with empty pots when they are able to find maybe a small community kitchen that still has supplies. If you look at what's actually being distributed right now in Gaza as sort of a meal, it's not even food. It's really mostly just a broth. Even prior to, the last 2 weeks and everything completely basically running out, when we were distributing and other organizations were distributing hot meals, it was really just a few handfuls of rice. I mean, the thing is, the hope obviously is that by allowing in a few more trucks, it might then allow for more to continue to be able to enter. But as long as really the US and Israel hold on to this whole false narrative of, Hamas controls the aid, unless they allow aid to flow in, it's really just not even beginning to address the depth and breadth and scope of the needs inside Gaza.
Right, and apart from the food, medical aid is also much needed. Across the Gaza Strip, we've seen several hospitals come under fire, most recently the Indonesian hospital. Can you give us some insight into what those hospitals look like right now, how medical workers are dealing with this onslaught?
I mean, one also needs to just take a second and realize that, these aren't one-off, mass casualty events that they're dealing with. They've been dealing with this for 18, 19 months right now. I'm in touch with a number of doctors who I've grown to know over the last year plus that I've been inside, and the things that they send messages like, Arwa, I'm exhausted, but I'm ashamed of how exhausted I am. I'm ashamed of how hard it is for me to get out of bed. And they end up having to be so creative sometimes in terms of just trying to cobble together what sort of would resemble something like a colostomy bag. You have had, children in hospital, in the ICU, who weren't stabilizing because the ICU did not have access to a pediatric tracheostomy tube. It's very basic. It's a piece of plastic that is that big. You have children who need feeding tubes because their tubes have either, completely worn out, or in the case of one child, it was eaten through by rats. That's not available, not to mention the horrific surgeries that are happening right now, from, women having to undergo C-sections to, burn injuries that normally would be treated under anesthesia that are being treated without. The level of psychological and physical exhaustion that is being felt across Gaza by so many people is not something that any of us on the outside can actually begin to comprehend.
In terms of how the distribution of aid is going to be facilitated today, hopefully, Netanyahu said that they're going to use the UN to distribute the aid until a US aid system is put into effect across the Strip. UN officials have warned against this. They have warned that if they go through with using the US system, it's going to only lead to more death across the Strip. Why is that? Walk us through what the UN compared to the US system is.
Well, as a baseline, the UN has roughly 400 distribution points across Gaza. This US-Israeli plan, because even though US officials say it's not an Israeli plan, it is. We saw a version in the humanitarian sector of this plan back in November, has 4 distribution points that are being set up, all in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. So if we just for a moment set aside the legality of this, and we set aside the argument that this is the militarization of aid and just look at it from pure practicalities. For someone to be able to get to one of these 4 hubs, if they're in Gaza City, for example, they're going to have to walk roughly, 4 to 6 hours. Most food parcels that are distributed that would sustain a family for about 2 weeks, they can weigh roughly 30 to 50 kilos. So that's, 60 to 80 pounds. How is this person supposed to get that back to their location? There's no transportation in Gaza. And then let's hypothetically assume that they were able to. What are they going to cook with? There's no fuel. There's very little wood that's left to burn, which is why the community kitchens that operate are so vital, because they're able to cook and then distribute to the community. And then if we look at this from the premise upon which this whole plan is based, which is the false narrative of Hamas controls the aid, it still doesn't make sense, because who is protecting this aid and the individual who has received it once they go back into their community? The thing is, if one were to base a plan on the premise that Hamas is in fact stealing the aid, how do you prevent that from happening? You prevent the aid from having a monetary value on the market. Aid only has value on the market because of its scarcity. So if you really wanted to stop Hamas from having this hypothetical income that it is allegedly getting from stealing the aid, the one way to do that is to flood the zone with the aid. Let those 9,000 trucks in.
Arwa Damon, thank you so much for being with me here on the NewsHour and sharing that insight with us. I appreciate it.